Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yolisa Nyoka, the Program Director for Market Access Africa. I am joined by the esteemed Dr. Mthandazo Ngwenya, the Managing Director for Big in Africa, and he'll be discussing the AfCFTA positioning markets trade facilitation into transformative solutions. Dr. Ngwenya, we are so thrilled to have you here to discuss this critical topic around trade facilitation and the transformative solutions that can be embarked to ease the processes and hopefully upheave the production capacity. So with that being said, may you kindly introduce yourself to the audience and a brief background of yourself?
Okay, thank you very much, Yolisa. As you've rightly indicated, my name is Dr. Mthandazo Ngwenya, and I work for an infrastructure development firm that operates out of different countries on the African continent, when at least over 22 other African countries, working with state agencies, international development organizations, and other major donors to unlock different infrastructure solutions to allow for Africa's development.
Fantastic. And with that being done, let's go straight into it. Now, your insights on the AfCFTA and its potential impact on Africa's agriculture will be invaluable to the audience. So jumping straight to the first question, given your experience managing development funds and assets targeting high-impact sectors in Africa, how do you envision the AfCFTA facilitating significant growth in Africa's agriculture sector?
Well, I think at the core of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area agreement and its prior concepts has been the notion of maximizing the amount of trade amongst the African countries, which is extremely low if one looks at all of the other regions of the world, trending at less than 15 to 18%. We should be looking at much higher numbers, around 60 to 70% intra-African trade. And as a consequence of that, the markets internationally do not take in as much goods from Africa because of the logistical elements and the perishable nature of a lot of agricultural produce. So trading within the African continent and maximizing each other's markets should, by default, increase the African market for agriculture. A very simple concept is you have places like Kenya that are increasing in the amount of avocado manufacturing. It's out of season in other parts of the African continent, but a lot of Kenyan avocados are heading to the Middle East and not to the East African community or even the West African community, purely because of logistics and trade-related barriers that exist amongst the African countries. So creating an inter-African platform that allows for easy movements of goods, such as agricultural produce, should definitely be in the best interest of all Africans, even from a food security perspective.
Absolutely. Following up then on that particular question, Dr. Ngwenya, what strategies then should stakeholders adopt to maximize these benefits in transforming agriculture's markets?
I mean, trading under the new African Continental Free Trade Area platform commenced in January 2024. South Africa is, for example, started trading to at least 12 other countries that have acceded onto the platform. And the critical thing that the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat would want is quick agreement amongst member states on issues related to the rules of origin and how the tariff reductions will then take place post that point. Speeding up the functioning of the dispute settlement mechanism within the trade system becomes another very, very critical factor. And fast-tracking domestic regulations that speak to the new trade regime so that there's a seamlessness in terms of process. There needs to be a beefing up of monitoring and reporting mechanisms. While we have a very good technology that the Secretariat will deploy on these platforms, but we need to be vigilant as well as African citizens to ensure that when we speak about the free movement of goods, people, and services, that translates to the actual behavior of officials who must process this exchange of people, process the exchange of goods, so that what happens on the ground is actually matched by the policy directions of governments.
That's really fascinating. And then moving then specifically onto legal frameworks, especially what you've touched on right now. Are there any updated legal or financial frameworks that will be essential to support the smooth implementation? And how can these legal frameworks be harmonized to reduce the barriers and increase trade efficiency? You mentioned one example, but is there another example that you can mention to lean onto that?
Yeah, I mean, so the way that the continental trade architecture is framed is we are in regional economic communities. So we have SADC, we have the East African Community, and others. And the notion of trade is premised on that. There's liberalization within the regional economic communities on a common African Union platform, and that those regional economic communities must then come together to create a broader, in the end, we need a broader African customs union, not 55 customs procedures across the entire continent. So there is significant harmonization that's required, for example, at a very simple level like that. Other regions you will see are fast tracking on the movement of people, the issue of regional passports. So you have a East Africa passport, would like to see SADC having a similar situation, would like to see the West African regions also having a similar situation, because unless people can move and have the cross-border trade with ease, there will always be challenges in terms of Africans trading freely with one another. You have the super links that cross through many of the border crossings around the African continent. The processing of those trucks, the drivers, their passports, their validations needs to be operating much more seamlessly, so that we don't have trucks stuck with customs officials at border posts, increasing the cost of actually moving goods from one country to the other. So I think that agenda has been very clearly laid out by the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, and a lot of the member states have started making some progression towards that element. There's also issues related to settlement of goods within the platform in local currencies, and then a mechanism to then balance out the forex movements annually, so that it's easy to actually trade from Kenya to Uganda or from DRC to Rwanda, whatever the case might be, and have settlements taking place in local currencies, and not everything being based on a dollar-based formula.
Absolutely. And then with sustainability being the critical part of or aspect of your work, Dr. Ngwenya, how can the African free trade movement align with the sustainable development goals to ensure that trade facilitation not only boosts economic growth, but also promotes environmental and social sustainability in the sector?
I mean, I think if one looks at the current situation, if I speak about, say, the Big in Africa group that I'm involved with, the biggest challenge to trading, minus all of the other issues that we've spoken about, is the connective infrastructure across the continent. So it's still not easy because of the quality of the roads, because of the quality of the airports, because of the quality of the rail infrastructure, for stuff to move very easily across the continent. I would expect the primary focus to be on unlocking African infrastructure. And you spoke about the issues around sustainability and impact funds. A lot of African countries have projects that they would like to commission. Another airport in Ghana, Sekondi Takoradi, is looking at elements like that to boost that level of trade in that area. The South Africa-Zimbabwe Beitbridge border post upgrades that both South Africa and Zimbabwe have been working on, because that's one of the busiest border crossings on the African continent for trade heading towards the port in Durban. Boosting the capacity of the commuter rail systems to move people between different countries, because the cost of flights are just completely exorbitant and make it impossible for people to connect. So if we look at where the impact can be most felt, is assisting governments to design and prepare projects. Donors could play a fundamental role that then unlocks, push the projects up to a bankable stage, and then you can probably look at other commercial investors to come in and cause the realization of these projects. Huge ideas on the African continent. Everywhere you look, you speak to government, they would like to develop a port there, a hospital over there, but the finance to prep these projects is extremely scarce. Post bankability, yes. So impact can be felt if we channel the pre-bankability phase to ensure that projects actually see the light of day. Because there's a lot of good ideas that simply stay as ideas because we can't fund them to their full fruition. But while doing all of that, we must make sure we do not leave anyone behind. When we build these new roads, these new ports and so on, how does the local community also benefit from that through local economic participation and empowerment? One of the critical pillars of the continental free trade area is the empowerment of women and the youth. Women are some of the biggest cross-border traders. I think they make up almost 70% of the informal cross-border trade. How, as we create these platforms, we make sure that we bring them aboard, because they have been driving this trade, though informally, to make sure that they can also participate in their economic emancipation. Human-centric designs that consider the true needs of the local communities when the infrastructure is being developed. But those trade corridors, whether they be rail, whether they be air cargo, whether it be canals, look at the relationship between Lesotho and South Africa in terms of the Lesotho Highlands water project. That's a massive cross-border trade system that's taking place there. Lots of infrastructure being built to bring water to South Africa. South Africa benefits from that, and there's a relationship then that exists between those two countries. But while that is happening, let's make sure that our communities where we're developing this civil infrastructure are not bystanders in their own development, because then that, while solving one issue, we create other problems at the same time.
Absolutely, Dr. Ngwenya. You touched upon financial impact, and you touched upon trade corridors being implemented. And it's actually, coming back now to my last question in terms of seeing the future and having that future insight, especially towards what you previously touched on and the exciting projects that are happening within Southern Africa specifically. So looking ahead, what recommendations would you give the African governments and private sector players to navigate these challenges and these opportunities that are coming up presented by the African Free Trade Movement, just tying in everything that is especially harnessing trade as it currently stands right now?
I would say, number one, let's accelerate the spirit and the latter of the regional economic communities. Some regional economic communities are lagging far behind others in terms of integrating in the region. If you can't integrate with your own neighboring countries, how will you integrate with others who are in a different regional economic community? So the RECs need to fast track their program of action to ensure that when we merge these RECs together, there's far much more seamlessness. So that is a massive focus that I think governments need to be paying attention to, and that includes informing citizens so that citizens understand when we speak about an African Union or a singular currency or borderless Africa, what does that mean? Because there's different understandings in different places. And as a consequence of that, it creates what the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area would refer to as these NTPs, which are these non-tariff barriers, which are barriers outside of the trade system put up by different countries almost on a protection basis, which inhibit trade. And in fact, without resolving these non-tariff barriers, they are some of the biggest barriers to fast-tracking the implementation of this new trade architecture. So all of those nationally driven policy positions, because naturally of domestic politics in the different regions, governments sometimes focus on the domestic elements and forget about the grander vision, which is there, which is to ensure that we have a Africa that is connected. We have 1.2 billion people projected to grow to quite a significant number, youthful population looking for opportunities. You've got to make sure that the youth find expression somewhere, because you know, if the youth are not kept busy with productive activities, we've seen what happens in terms of them rising up against institutions. So they cannot be ignored. So these are just, I think, some of the very important things that governments need to focus on. Strengthening the role of the Pan-African Parliament. We've got to ensure that the African Court of Justice functions properly to resolve those interstate disputes. We don't always have to take all of our disputes to the International Court of Justice. We have certain mechanisms on the continent that are there. Rejuvenate the SADC tribunal, which used to sit in Namibia. It hasn't operated in a number of years. So as we trade more with each other, in the beginning, there will be some disputes. We need sound continental platforms for dispute resolution so that people have confidence in this system and can start to win themselves off the trade with the West and the East, but to look at the other African countries as viable trade partners. Lastly, Yodi, on the issue of industrialization, right? So if we're having production of raw materials, whether it's cocoa in Ghana or coffee in Kenya, or avocados or platinum mines, massive platinum mines in the Southern African region, taking all of that raw material unprocessed and sending it overseas and buying it back at exorbitant prices. There has to be an ability for that manufacturing and processing base to sit on the continent to allow beneficiation. That is why we are not having as much financing on the African continent as we should, because we are not beneficiating. We dig up stuff, we get agricultural produce, we don't process, and we send raw materials outside of the continent and then repurchase those materials having been beneficiated in other markets at exorbitant prices. I mean, that is not economics. So there has got to be a deliberateness in the regional economic communities to look at hubs of excellence, special economic zones that focus on beneficiating and industrialization. To create jobs, it will reduce the amount of dependence on outside of Africa processing capacity. It will boost trade relationships and naturally the revenues that the countries can make out of their natural endowments.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Vane. That was such invaluable insights. Is there any last words that you'd like to relate to our audience? We've really been speaking heavily on the African free trade movement and how beneficiation is a buzzword that's within the industry as well. We mentioned key critical factors within how the government and African government sectors can really work together to increase financial investment within the agriculture sector. So a lot of points, validated points that have been raised in discussion. Is there any closing remarks that you'd like to give to our audience in relation to our key theme in pivoting Africa as the next quarter?
Yeah, I think I'm a big believer in the youth. We should be having one of the most youthful populations in the world if one looks at the next 20, 30, 50 years. We have to invest in the youth. We have to give them cutting edge skills and train them to world-class levels so that they can compete and participate in a global economy. So we have to ensure that everything is done to set aside from the national budgets enough training to allow youths to actively participate. Because unless they have the skills, unless there's an enabling environment, it's very difficult for youth to take up agriculture. How do they do that if they haven't been trained or there is no startup capital for them to participate in these agricultural opportunities? If we don't do that, it will be the same old players still taking advantage of these new opportunities while our youth keep left behind. So let's trust in this future generation. But before we can trust them, we need to invest in them and give them world-class skills and capabilities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Venya. Thank you so much for your time and wishing you a great year forward. Thank you so much to the audience. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.